"You don't need to worry, Grandma. They're coming for you today." Those were the words my grandson whispered as he stood in the doorway of my kitchen, pale and shaking, on a bright Saturday morning that had started like any other. I was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal, sunlight pouring through the lace curtains I had sewn myself more than 20 years ago. The house smelled like cinnamon and brewed coffee, the same comforting scent that had greeted my son every morning when he was a boy. I remember turning slowly, wooden spoon still in my hand, trying to make sense of the fear in Ethan's blue eyes. At 14, he was usually all restless energy and half-finished jokes. But that morning he looked older somehow, as if he had seen something no child should have to understand. I forced a smile, the kind that had carried me through funerals, hospital waiting rooms, and too many silent family dinners. "Coming for me? Who is?" I asked lightly, as if we were discussing the weather. Ethan swallowed hard and glanced toward the hallway that led to the guest room where his mother had been staying since their house renovation had supposedly begun. Even now, thinking back, I realize how carefully everything had been arranged. The sudden construction delays, the unexpected request to move in, the overly cheerful text from Vanessa asking if I needed help with groceries, if she could drive me to church, if she could reorganize my pantry because she just loved keeping busy. I had told myself it was kindness. I had wanted to believe that time had softened the edges between us. After all, grief has a way of making you crave peace more than truth. My husband had been gone for 3 years, and this quiet colonial on Maple Ridge Drive had become both my refuge and my responsibility. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every stubborn cabinet hinge, every rosebush that needed pruning in early April. It was my home, my history, my last piece of certainty in a world that seemed to move faster every year. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. "I heard Mom talking on the phone last night," he said. "She said it had to happen today before anyone could stop it." His words landed softly but carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I set the spoon down and wiped my hands on a dish towel, buying myself a moment to think. Vanessa had always been good with timing. She knew exactly when to smile, when to sigh, when to let tears gather in her eyes just long enough to win sympathy before they could fall. I had watched her reshape family gatherings into performances where she was always the heroine, and someone else quietly became the villain. Usually that someone else was me. Still I had endured. For my son's sake. For Ethan's. For the fragile illusion that family meant safety. Outside, a car door slammed sharp enough to make us both flinch. I walked to the front window, pushing aside the curtain with fingers that suddenly felt colder than they should. A black sedan had pulled up at the curb, its engine still running. 2 figures sat inside, silhouettes against the morning glare. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, silver hair pinned neatly in place, cardigan buttoned just so. The picture of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning how to remain composed. Behind me, Ethan's voice trembled. "Grandma, I think she put something in your bag. I saw her go into your room when you were gardening yesterday." The world did not shatter. It did not spin. Instead, it narrowed into something precise and quiet, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. I turned back to him and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for telling me," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. Fear would not help us now. Panic would only give someone else the ending they had already written for me. In the distance, I heard another car approach, tires crunching over gravel with deliberate authority. Whoever was coming had been invited. Whoever was coming believed they already knew the truth. I lifted my handbag from the chair by the door, feeling its unfamiliar heaviness, and for the first time that morning, I allowed myself a small knowing smile. The front doorbell rang once, then again, each chime echoing through the hallway like a polite warning that something irreversible had already been set in motion. I did not rush to answer. Instead, I stood very still in the center of my living room, listening to the faint ticking of the grandfather clock Noel had bought at an estate sale during our 10th anniversary trip to Vermont. Time had always felt like an ally to me, a quiet companion that rewarded patience and punished impulsiveness. That morning I decided it would have to remain that way. Ethan hovered near the staircase, his backpack still slung over one shoulder even though it was Saturday. His eyes kept darting toward the front door as if he expected it to burst open at any second. I reached for his hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Go upstairs," I told him gently. "And stay there until I call you." He hesitated, the way children do when they realize adults are pretending everything is fine. Then he nodded and disappeared. His footsteps light but hurried against the polished oak steps. The bell rang a third time, longer now, followed by a firm knock that carried authority without raising its voice. I walked to the door with measured steps, each one grounded in decades of experience. I had raised a son on my own for several years while Noel built his small accounting firm from the ground up. I had navigated hospital corridors filled with unfamiliar machines and complicated words when illness first entered our lives. I had survived loss without losing myself. Whoever stood outside did not know that. When I opened the door, 2 uniformed officers greeted me with professional courtesy that felt almost rehearsed. A man and a woman, both young enough to be my grandchildren, both wearing expressions carefully balanced between sympathy and suspicion. Behind them, the black sedan idled at the curb like a patient witness. "Mrs. Whitmore?" the woman asked. I inclined my head. "Yes. How may I help you?" She explained that they had received a report regarding missing jewelry, connected to a local charity fundraiser, held the previous evening at the country club. Her words were calm, factual, delivered in a tone meant to avoid alarm. Still, I could feel the weight of accusation settling into the air between us. I stepped aside and invited them in. Good manners, after all, cost nothing. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Vanessa standing at the entrance to the dining room, one hand pressed lightly to her chest as if she had just witnessed something deeply distressing. She wore a soft cream sweater and the concerned expression she had perfected over the years. "Margaret, what is happening?" she asked, her voice trembling in all the right places. I almost admired the performance. The officers requested permission to take a look around, explaining that they were simply following procedure. I agreed without hesitation and gestured toward the sitting area where sunlight painted quiet rectangles across the rug. Vanessa hovered nearby, offering tea. No one accepted, wringing her hands in a silent display of loyalty. My son Daniel appeared moments later, hair still damp from the shower, confusion clouding his features. He looked from me to the officers to his wife, searching for a narrative he could understand. I watched realization flicker across his face when the male officer politely asked if I would mind showing them the handbag I had been carrying the night before. The room seemed to shrink as I placed it on the coffee table. The unfamiliar heaviness Ethan had warned me about pulsed in my memory like a second heartbeat. Vanessa stepped closer, her concern sharpening into something almost eager before she could mask it again. Daniel crossed his arms, not in defiance but in discomfort, as if bracing for news he did not want to hear. I opened the clasp slowly, aware of every gaze fixed upon my hands. Inside lay my wallet, my reading glasses, a neatly folded shopping list written in blue ink. And beneath them, wrapped in tissue paper I had never seen before, something that did not belong to me. I did not gasp. I did not protest. Instead, I met Vanessa's eyes and offered a small, courteous smile that seemed to unsettle her far more than any accusation could have. The officer unfolded the tissue paper with careful fingers, revealing a necklace that caught the morning light in a way that felt almost theatrical, each diamond flashing like a silent accusation. The woman officer inhaled softly while her partner stepped closer to examine the piece, his expression tightening into something more official. I could hear Vanessa's breath quicken behind me, a faint tremor of anticipation that she could not quite hide. Daniel stared at the coffee table, as if the polished wood might offer him an explanation that the people in the room could not. For a long moment no one spoke. Silence has always been powerful. It fills the spaces where truth has not yet decided how it wants to. "Arrive. Mrs. Whitmore," the officer said finally, his voice respectful but firm. "This matches the description of an item reported stolen last night." I nodded once, acknowledging the information without granting it ownership over my composure. I had spent too many years learning that dignity is often the last defense a person has. Vanessa took a hesitant step forward, her hand fluttering toward Daniel's arm before she allowed it to fall back to her side. "Margaret, I do not understand," she said, her voice soft enough to suggest compassion but loud enough to ensure the officers heard every word. "You were with us at the fundraiser. You left early. I thought you were feeling tired." Her performance was almost flawless. Almost. I noticed the way her gaze flickered briefly toward the staircase where Ethan had disappeared, as if calculating whether the one witness she could not fully control might still be listening. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he had never outgrown since childhood. "Mom," he began, struggling to keep his tone neutral. "Maybe there is some kind of mistake." Mistake. The word hovered in the air like a fragile promise that could shatter at any second. I folded my hands in my lap and met his eyes. "There may be many things," I replied quietly, "but panic will not help us discover which one is true." The officers exchanged a glance that carried years of training in reading rooms like this one. They asked me if I would be willing to accompany them to the station to answer a few questions. It was phrased as a request, but the expectation behind it was unmistakable. Vanessa pressed her lips together, her concern deepening into a carefully measured sadness. "This is all so shocking," she murmured. "Margaret has always been so proud of her reputation." I almost laughed. Pride had never been about reputation for me. It had been about survival. Outside, a breeze stirred the wind chimes on the porch, their gentle melody drifting through the open window as if nature itself were offering commentary. I rose from the sofa with deliberate grace, smoothing the front of my skirt. "Of course," I said. "I will cooperate fully." Daniel stepped forward as if he wanted to protest but could not find the words. I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension coiled beneath his skin. He had always hated uncertainty. Vanessa, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in it. As we moved toward the front door, I allowed myself a brief glance at the staircase. For an instant, I caught sight of Ethan's face between the banister spindles, pale but resolute. He lifted his hand slightly, an almost invisible gesture that reminded me of the envelope he had slipped into my cardigan pocket earlier that morning. His voice barely above a whisper as he said it might help me later. I had not opened it yet. Timing, I reminded myself again, is everything. The officers guided me outside into the crisp late spring air, where the black sedan waited like the next chapter of a story someone else believed they had already written. I paused on the porch, letting the sunlight warm my face, and then stepped forward with the calm certainty of a woman who understood that truth, like justice, often arrives exactly when it is needed most. The ride to the station was quiet enough that I could hear the faint hum of the tires against the asphalt and the distant rhythm of a passing train somewhere beyond the rows of budding maple trees. The male officer drove with both hands firmly on the wheel while his partner occasionally glanced at me in the rearview mirror, not with hostility but with a professional curiosity that suggested she was trying to understand what kind of woman would remain so composed under such circumstances. I rested my handbag on my lap and kept my gaze fixed on the passing storefronts, the familiar diner with the faded red sign, the florist where Noelle used to buy peonies every spring, the small library whose brick walls had watched generations of children grow into adults. Everything looked unchanged, which made the situation feel even more unreal. It is strange how the world continues exactly as it should when your own life begins to tilt in an unexpected direction. I thought about the night before at the fundraiser, about the polished floors of the country club ballroom, and the soft murmur of conversations drifting beneath crystal chandeliers. Vanessa had insisted I attend, saying it would be good for me to be out among friends again. She had chosen my dress herself, a pale blue silk that still hung neatly in my closet, and had complimented me with such enthusiasm that even the skeptical part of my mind had softened. Looking back now, I could see the careful choreography in every detail, the way she introduced me to donors, the way she lingered near my handbag when I stepped away to speak with an old neighbor. At the time, I had only felt a faint discomfort, like a draft in a room whose windows were all supposedly closed. The car turned into the station parking lot, gravel crunching beneath the tires with a finality that felt almost ceremonial. When we stepped inside, the air carried the familiar scent of paper, coffee, and something metallic that I could not quite place. A young clerk looked up from behind the front desk, her expression flickering from routine politeness to mild surprise as she took in the scene. I was guided to a small interview room with neutral walls and a rectangular table that had probably witnessed hundreds of similar conversations. The officers assured me again that this was simply a matter of clarification, that cooperation would help resolve everything more quickly. I nodded, placing my handbag carefully on the table, as if it were an object of study rather than accusation. As they left me alone for a few minutes, I finally reached into the pocket of my cardigan and withdrew the envelope Ethan had given me. It was sealed with a strip of clear tape, the edges slightly crumpled as though he had hidden it somewhere secret before gathering the courage to pass it to me. My hands did not tremble as I opened it. Inside, I found a small flash drive and a folded note written in his uneven handwriting. He had apologized for snooping, explained that he had overheard his mother discussing a plan that would teach Grandma a lesson, and had secretly recorded a conversation on his phone before transferring it to the device. The words were simple, urgent, filled with the fierce loyalty only a child can offer when he realizes the adults around him are no longer safe. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting gratitude replace the last traces of doubt. Timing once again had chosen its side. When the officers returned with a legal pad and gentle questions about my whereabouts, my relationships, and the events of the previous evening, I answered each one calmly, aware that truth often reveals itself not through dramatic declarations but through steady persistence. Outside the narrow window, clouds drifted slowly across the sky, casting shifting shadows on the pavement, as if even the sun understood that clarity sometimes requires patience. I listened to the questions without interruption, answering with the same measured clarity I had used throughout my life whenever circumstances demanded more strength than comfort. The officers wrote down each detail, occasionally exchanging quiet glances that suggested their certainty was beginning to soften around the edges. When they finally asked if there was anything else I wished to add, I placed the small flash drive gently on the table between us. The simple object seemed to change the atmosphere in the room more effectively than any raised voice could have. I explained that my grandson had given it to me that morning, that he had been frightened by something he overheard, and that I believed it might provide context for the misunderstanding we were all trying to resolve. The female officer hesitated only briefly before taking the device and stepping out to consult with someone down the hallway. I remained seated, folding my hands and allowing my thoughts to drift back through the subtle shifts that had marked the past few months. Vanessa's sudden interest in my finances, her repeated suggestions that I might be happier in a smaller place, somewhere with less maintenance and fewer memories. Her gentle reminders that property values were at their peak, and that selling now would be the smart move. At the time, I had attributed her persistence to practicality. Now, in the quiet hum of the station, those conversations rearranged themselves into a pattern that felt impossible to ignore. When the officer returned, her expression had changed. The polite distance was still there, but it was accompanied by a spark of alertness that had not existed before. She asked me to wait while they reviewed the contents more thoroughly. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour, measured by the slow movement of the second hand on the wall clock and the distant murmur of phones ringing somewhere beyond the interview room. I watched dust motes drift through a beam of sunlight and reminded myself that truth rarely arrives in dramatic bursts. It unfolds. It reveals. It asks to be seen. Eventually the door opened again, and both officers entered together, their posture subtly more respectful than before. They informed me that the recording appeared to capture a conversation in which a woman's voice, remarkably similar to Vanessa's, discussed placing an item in my bag during the fundraiser, and then contacting authorities anonymously. There was mention of inheritance, of ensuring that I would no longer be in the way, of creating a situation that would force my son to choose sides. The words were clear enough to shift the balance of the morning. I did not feel triumph, only a steady confirmation that patience had once again proven its worth. They asked if I would be willing to remain at the station a little longer while they verified additional details. I agreed without hesitation. Outside the narrow window, I noticed the black sedan still parked beneath the budding trees, its dark shape now less imposing than before. Somewhere across town, Vanessa was likely rehearsing her next expression of concern, unaware that the story she had so carefully scripted was beginning to unravel thread by thread. I reached for my handbag and straightened the strap across my shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of my life settle back into place. There are moments when the future turns quietly, without announcement, and I sensed that one of those moments had just begun. They did not let me leave the station immediately. Not because they believed I had done anything wrong, but because the situation had shifted into something far more delicate than a simple misunderstanding. I was escorted to a larger office with a window that overlooked the parking lot where late morning sunlight had begun to bleach the color from everything it touched. The same black sedan was still there, though now it felt less like a threat and more like a relic of a plan that had already begun to crumble. One of the officers offered me coffee in a paper cup that warmed my hands as I sat down and waited for whatever would come next. Waiting has never frightened me. It has always been a form of preparation. Across the desk, a detective introduced himself in a calm, measured voice and explained that they had contacted the charity organizer to confirm the details of the missing necklace. Surveillance footage from the ballroom was already being reviewed. My presence, he assured me, was now considered cooperative rather than suspicious. I inclined my head, grateful not for the reassurance itself but for the quiet acknowledgement that truth was beginning to take shape. Minutes later the door opened again, and Daniel stepped inside with a look I had never seen on his face before. It was not anger or disbelief. It was something heavier, like the first realization that the world you trusted might have been rearranged without your consent. He crossed the room slowly, as if uncertain whether he had the right to come any closer. "Mom," he said, his voice low and strained, "Vanessa told me you must be terrified." I studied him for a moment, remembering the boy who used to run toward me after school with scraped knees and stories about playground victories. "I am not terrified," I replied gently. "I am patient." He sat down across from me, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. He admitted that Vanessa had called him earlier, her voice trembling with what she described as heartbreak, insisting that she could not understand how something like this could happen in our family. I listened without interruption. There was no need to argue with someone who had not yet decided what he believed. Outside the office window, a patrol car pulled into the lot, followed by another vehicle I recognized immediately. Vanessa stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses despite the mild spring light, her posture straight and purposeful as she approached the entrance. Even from a distance, I could sense the careful performance already forming around her. The detective excused himself to greet her while Daniel remained seated, staring at the floor as though it might offer him answers he was not ready to hear aloud. When Vanessa finally entered the office, she removed her sunglasses with deliberate slowness, revealing eyes that glistened with perfectly measured distress. "Margaret," she said, moving toward me as if she intended to offer comfort rather than accusation, "I came as soon as I could." Her gaze flickered briefly to Daniel, then to the detective, calculating the balance of sympathy in the room. I returned her look with the same calm courtesy I had maintained all morning. There are moments when confrontation does not require raised voices or dramatic gestures. It requires presence. The detective informed her that new information had come to light, that they needed to ask additional questions about her movements during the fundraiser. For a fraction of a second, something in her expression faltered. It was subtle enough that Daniel might have missed it, but I did not. Years of observing family dynamics had sharpened my ability to read the smallest shifts in tone and posture. Vanessa recovered quickly, offering explanations about misplaced clutches, crowded dance floors, and the chaos of organizing donations. Her words flowed smoothly, almost convincingly, yet the room no longer belonged to her narrative. I reached into my handbag and rested my hand on the folded note Ethan had written, drawing quiet strength from the reminder that loyalty can appear in the most unexpected places. As the detective began outlining the timeline they had reconstructed from witness statements and partial footage, I sensed the fragile architecture of Vanessa's certainty beginning to fracture. Daniel looked from her to me, then back again, the weight of choice settling onto his shoulders like a storm that could no longer be postponed. In that still, sunlit office, I realized that truth does not always arrive as a sudden revelation. Sometimes it advances step by step, until even those who try to ignore it can no longer pretend it is not standing directly in front of them. The conversation in the office did not explode into accusations the way people often imagine such moments will. Instead, it unfolded with a quiet tension that seemed to stretch the air itself. Vanessa continued speaking in that controlled, reassuring tone she had perfected over the years, offering details that sounded plausible enough to anyone who had not yet begun to look beneath the surface. She described the fundraiser as chaotic, filled with guests moving from table to table, handbags being set down and picked up in a blur of laughter and polite applause. She insisted that she had barely left Daniel's side all evening. I watched her carefully, noting the way her fingers traced the edge of the desk as if searching for something solid to hold on to. The detective listened without interruption, occasionally jotting down notes, occasionally glancing toward a monitor position just beyond Vanessa's line of sight. Daniel remained seated between us, his posture rigid, his gaze shifting from one face to the other as though he were trying to assemble a truth that refused to present itself neatly. When the detective finally spoke again, his voice was calm but carried a new firmness that had not been there before. He explained. That preliminary review of the ballroom footage showed Vanessa moving through the crowd several times alone, including one moment when she paused near the table where my handbag had been placed beside my chair. He did not accuse her directly. He simply laid out the timeline as it appeared on the screen. Vanessa blinked once, then smiled faintly, suggesting that the camera angle must have been misleading, that she had likely been searching for a misplaced program or greeting another donor. Her composure was admirable. It was also beginning to look rehearsed. I reached into my handbag and withdrew the folded note Ethan had written, smoothing the creases with deliberate care before placing it on the desk. My grandson overheard a conversation, I said quietly. He believed I should know. Daniel leaned forward, his breath catching as he read the uneven lines, each word a small but undeniable shift in the narrative he had trusted. Vanessa's gaze flickered toward him, then toward me, calculation briefly overtaking concern. For the first time that morning, she seemed unsure which version of herself the room required. The detective asked if she would mind remaining for further questions while additional footage was reviewed and witness statements were confirmed. She agreed, though the confidence in her voice had begun to thin like mist under rising sunlight. Outside, clouds gathered along the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot that mirrored the uncertainty settling inside the office. I felt no urgency to speak again. Silence, when chosen carefully, can become a mirror that forces others to confront their own reflections. Daniel finally turned to me, his expression no longer clouded by confusion but sharpened by something closer to realization. "Mom," he said softly, "did you suspect any of this?" I met his eyes and offered a small steady nod. "I suspected that kindness can sometimes be used as camouflage," I replied. Vanessa let out a quiet laugh that sounded more like a defense than amusement. She began recounting the sacrifices she had made for our family, the plans she had proposed to ensure our financial security, the countless times she had encouraged Daniel to spend more time with me. Her words flowed in practiced rhythms, yet each sentence seemed to widen the distance between her version of events and the evidence slowly assembling around her. The detective excused himself once more to consult with colleagues, leaving the three of us alone in a room where sunlight now struggled to push through thickening clouds. I folded my hands in my lap and waited, aware that patience was no longer just a strategy, but the quiet force guiding the entire day forward. Somewhere beyond the station walls, the wind had begun to rise, rattling the leaves of the young maples as if nature itself were reminding us that storms, once set in motion, do not easily change direction. The detective returned just as the first drops of rain began tapping against the office window, a soft, steady rhythm that seemed to underscore the quiet inevitability unfolding inside the room. He carried a thin folder and a tablet, placing both carefully on the desk before taking his seat. Vanessa straightened in her chair, lifting her chin with renewed determination, as if the mere act of preparing herself could alter the direction of what was about to happen. Daniel watched the movement with a growing stillness that spoke louder than any outburst ever could. I remained exactly where I had been, hands folded, posture relaxed, allowing the moment to arrive without resistance. The detective explained that additional footage from a secondary camera had been located, one positioned near the exit corridor that led toward the coat check, and the quieter tables at the edge of the ballroom. The recording showed Vanessa approaching my chair while I was engaged in conversation several yards away, her movements deliberate rather than hurried, her expression focused in a way that did not match the casual socializing she had described. There was a brief pause in the video where she appeared to lean over my handbag, shielding her actions from nearby guests with the graceful tilt of her shoulder. It was not dramatic. It was not obvious. It was simply precise. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her eyes fixed on the screen as though willing the images to rearrange themselves into something more favorable. She began to speak, suggesting that perhaps she had been searching for my reading glasses or adjusting the clasp because she feared it might fall open. The detective listened, then opened the folder to reveal printed statements from 2 event volunteers, who remembered seeing her near the table at that exact time. Their recollections were calm, factual, and consistent with the timeline already forming. Daniel pressed his palms against his knees, the sound of the rain growing heavier as realization settled over him like a weight he could no longer set aside. I felt no urge to intervene. Truth has its own voice, and it was finally being allowed to speak. Vanessa's composure shifted again, not breaking entirely but tightening around the edges, like fabric pulled too taut across a frame. She asked if the footage proved anything beyond coincidence, if anyone could truly say what she had been holding or doing in that crowded room. Her words were carefully chosen, yet the certainty that had once carried them forward was beginning to falter. The detective responded by placing the flash drive Ethan had given me beside the tablet, explaining that audio analysis had confirmed the voices on the recording were indeed Vanessa's and an unidentified companion discussing the plan in unmistakable detail. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply allowed the evidence to exist in the space between us. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to steady himself against a wave that had already begun to crest. When he opened them again, he looked not at Vanessa but at me, searching for something he could anchor himself to. I offered him a small nod, the same reassurance I had given him countless times when he was young and uncertain about the world's intentions. Outside, the rain intensified, blurring the view of the parking lot into streaks of gray and silver. Inside, the architecture of Vanessa's narrative continued to fracture under the quiet pressure of fact. She folded her hands together, then unfolded them, her gaze moving restlessly from the detective to Daniel to me. For the first time since the morning had begun, silence felt less like strategy and more like surrender. The detective informed her that further inquiry would be necessary, and that she might need to remain available for additional questioning. Vanessa nodded, though the motion seemed disconnected from the confidence she had displayed only hours before. I watched her carefully, recognizing the subtle shift from control to uncertainty, from performance to the uncomfortable awareness that the audience was no longer responding as expected. As thunder rolled softly in the distance, I realized that the storm we had all sensed approaching was finally breaking, not with spectacle or raised voices, but with the quiet, relentless clarity that only truth can bring. By the time the rain began to soften into a quiet mist, the room felt different, as if something invisible had finally shifted into its rightful place. Vanessa sat very still, her shoulders no longer squared with the effortless confidence she had worn like a second skin for so many years. The detective had finished outlining the next steps, his tone steady and professional, and Daniel remained beside me, his silence no longer uncertain but resolute. I could sense the moment approaching when decisions would have to be made not out of convenience or habit, but out of truth. I rose slowly from my chair, smoothing the fabric of my skirt the way I had done countless times before important conversations. No one tried to stop me. No one needed to. Some endings do not require permission. I will be returning home, I said calmly, meeting the detective's gaze. He nodded, offering a quiet assurance that arrangements would be made to keep me informed. Vanessa looked up then, her eyes searching mine as if hoping to find anger she could use or pity she could manipulate. Instead, she found only clarity. Daniel stood as well, instinctively reaching for my handbag before handing it back with a careful respect that felt like an apology he was not yet ready to speak aloud. We walked together through the station hallway where fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead and footsteps echoed in a rhythm that reminded me of long journeys finally reaching their destination. Outside, the air carried the clean scent that follows rain, the sky clearing in slow patches of pale blue. The black sedan was gone. In its place, a small sparrow hopped across the wet pavement, unconcerned with the dramas that had filled the morning. Daniel opened the car door for me, his movements deliberate, as though each gesture mattered more than the last. During the drive back to Maple Ridge Drive, he spoke in fragments, piecing together memories of conversations he had dismissed, warnings he had ignored, signs he had chosen not to see. I listened without judgment. Life has a way of teaching lessons in its own time. When we pulled into the driveway, Ethan was already waiting on the porch, his shoulders tense until he saw me step out of the car unharmed. He ran forward then, wrapping his arms around me with a relief that needed no explanation. I held him close, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine, and understood that loyalty is often the quiet force that saves us when pride cannot. Vanessa did not return that evening. The house felt larger without her presence, yet somehow lighter, as if the walls themselves were releasing a breath they had been holding for months. I made tea in the familiar kitchen, setting out 3 cups instead of 2, and watched as Daniel sat across from me with a humility I had not seen since he was young. He asked what I intended to do next. I told him that the future would require new boundaries, new arrangements, and perhaps difficult legal conversations about property and inheritance. My voice did not waver. Decisions made in calm moments tend to endure. Later, as twilight settled over the garden and the first stars appeared above the maple trees, I stepped outside alone. The roses Noel and I had planted decades ago were beginning to bloom again, their petals opening with patient certainty. I thought about the morning's accusations, the careful planning that had nearly succeeded, and the unexpected courage of a boy who refused to let injustice go unnoticed. In the quiet that followed, I allowed myself a small private smile. They had believed I would break. Instead, I had simply waited. And in the end, waiting had been enough.